All right, so today we're tackling Unit 4, Topic 6, Pests and Pest Control. In your textbook, it's Chapter 2.6, pages 149 to 175. And like I said, I'm breaking this up today. Today we're focusing more on pests. Tomorrow we're going to focus on pest control. Your objectives for today is I can list a variety of pests to plants. I can list chemical and natural forms of pest control, and I can discuss the pros and cons of each. So these objectives are going to cover today and they're going to cover tomorrow. So pests and pest control. So every year, tons of chemicals are used to control pest organisms that reduce a plant's ability to produce food and fiber. What are the effects on our natural systems, and are there any alternatives? So go ahead, I'm going to pause this. Use the chat feature. What are the effects on an ecosystem by using chemicals? All right, you guys have some really great answers. So the animals could die because the chemical is poisonous to them, and if they eat it, they may die. Someone else said it could kill other animals or it could kill mammals, and poison could impact development, like turning an eagle's eggshell, make it softer, delicate, and then the eagle isn't able to hatch. Or it could poison an animal nearby. You guys have such good prior knowledge from all the way back in Unit 1. I'm so proud. So what is a pest? So I really loved that in our pre-discussion that Bosco said your brother or sister can be a pest, because that is so true. So to farmers though, a pest is any organism that's causing plants to die or produce less than they otherwise would. So I'm going to have a ton of different pictures of pests destroying plants throughout this section. But yes, a pest also could be a person in your life. I agree with you, Bosco. So the pest problem. So in natural systems, or like an ecosystem, organisms have parasites, predators, or competing plants that help keep their numbers in check. In Unit 1, we talked a ton about ecosystems, and we talked about food chains, food webs, and we also talked about relationships between animals and organisms, whether it's bacteria or bugs or bumblebees or whales. We talked about predators, mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So we've talked about all of these things. The pests that cause the most damage are insects, fungi, and weedy plants. Weeds are thieves. They steal moisture, nutrients, space, or light from a crop. I don't know about you, but the first thing that my mom does whenever she goes to plant things in the spring or summer, or I'm sure Mrs. Gopenwe does with her garden, the first thing they do is they pull weeds out of the soil, because they don't want to plant anything new and have those weeds sprout up, take away moisture, nutrients, take up space, and then steal light. So every year, farmers spend millions of dollars to control pests and avoid food crop losses. So again, we're going to talk about insects, bacteria, weeds, and then we're going to start to talk about introduced species and when they become invasive. And as you can see, some of these things that are damaging these plants are coming from insects and bacteria in these pictures. And I'll say, it's not like blood and guts gory, but when you Google pictures of pests and their impact on plants, there's some really gruesome plant pictures out there from all the damage that's available. So what makes an insect a pest? So to go back to Bosco's siblings, brothers and sisters are pests. That's totally true. We all have our own definition of pests, but pests, in terms of what we're talking today, insects usually eat some part of the plant. Insects and diseases consume over 50% of Canada's annual harvest. So I want you to think about how we've been talking about how agriculture in Alberta is really important, and think of all of the things that farmers in Alberta, all of the things that they harvest and they grow and they ship out. Imagine 50% of that being gone. And that's the truth. Insects and disease wipe out 50% of harvest every single year. So what makes fungi and bacteria pests? So insects, they eat it, they destroy it. But fungi, so like mushrooms and mold and things like that, fungi and bacteria, they cause infection. So just like you could have a bacterial infection and you could have a cough and a sore throat and a stuffy nose, same thing with bacteria when it comes to plants. They cause infection, they destroy parts or all of the plant. So as you can see in these pictures, there's either fungi like mold in this bottom picture, or bacteria has consumed this piece of fruit, and notice like there's no way for us to pick it and cut around it. Like that whole fruit is completely destroyed, or parts of it. And then what makes a weed a pest? Okay, weeds. I'm sure we've seen dandelions, all of us. There's different types of grass as well that are weeds. If you look at your grass, there might be some grass. I know this usually grows close to sidewalks. At least as I'm looking outside at my parents' house, there's grass that's a little bit thicker, a little bit longer. It doesn't look like the other grass. That's another type of weed. Bamboo actually can be a weed as well. So weeds are plants that are growing where they're not wanted, right? Usually you don't have a beautiful dandelion garden. Usually dandelions show up random spots where you don't want them because they're weeds. Again, they compete for water, nutrients, light, and space. These plants can contaminate products at harvest, harbor pest insects. So insects could live in the weed. They may have mites, vertebrates, or be a source of plant disease. So they could carry bacteria or pest insects within themselves as a weed and then pass that to the crop or the flower or the other plant that they are close to. And then again, just to reiterate a little bit on our dandelions. And real quick, I'm looking at the chat and I love people are saying caterpillars can be pests. Absolutely. Bumblebees can be pests. Even though to flowers, bees are good because they assist with pollination. But when they fly around me, who runs away from bumblebees or swats at them? They're being a pest. They're being annoying. They're in a place where we don't want them. But yeah, caterpillars too, dandelions. I love it. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the dandelion. So the dandelion is a weed that just won't go away. So what makes a dandelion such a successful weed or pest? So if you look at this graphic in the center of your page, that dandelion has a really good structure to it. It has really powerful roots. So notice we learned about two types of roots. It's got a big tap root. So it's got that really long and strong root that goes strong into the ground. That root, since it is strong, it absorbs a ton of nutrients around it to keep it thriving, but it also holds it in place. You're not going to see a dandelion uprooted out of the ground and blown away. They're super strong. They have really broad leaves. So they have really strong leaves that are nice and big. They shade out. They take a lot of sun, causing shade on nearby plants, which is another reason they're a pest. They're taking the light. They have super seeds. So in dandelions, they start yellow, but then eventually as they age and they start to go through their life cycle, their seeds, they become the type that you can go and blow them. And because they're so easily transferred through the wind, they can grow, and they grow all summer long. They don't have a short season. They have a relatively long season, and each flower has hundreds of seeds that can go really long distances in the wind. They're super adaptable. So they grow in different kinds of soil. They're not specific to one type. They can grow in dry, in moist, in wet soil. They're really adaptable. And it takes chemicals to kill them. Really, dandelions are super, super strong plants. That's why you see them everywhere. Bosco says, that's why you should stop blowing the dandelion seeds. You're right, but it's so fun when you're a little kid. Yeah, exactly. Yukino says, I'm teaching my sister that dandelions are a weed and not a flower. I know, but I remember growing up, I used to pick them and be like, hey mom, look at the flowers I got you. And she's like, thanks. But yeah, dandelions, they are a plant that is just here to stay. They are a weed. And then in Alberta, so we've talked about some of the native plants to Alberta, and canola is one of them. Remember, it means Canada and oil, canola. It's popular with fungi, insects, and weeds. So all three of these types of pests love canola. So you can learn a little bit more on this. This is from your textbook, but it just talks about the different types of pests that impact canola. But again, there's bugs, so they suck the juice out of the buds, the flowers, and the seeds. There's worms. They eat everything in sight. They lay eggs on the blooming canola. So on the yellow flowers, they lay eggs. As soon as they grow up, they eat the flower away. There's different fungi that attack their stems. It lives in the soil. And then as soon as the canola starts to sprout from its seed and grow, it attacks that canola. And then there's some other types of bacterias that you can see go through the leaf axis. So right where it starts to sprout, it cuts off the flow of water in the stems. It affects the little seeds. And then there's others that go and pull the water, so it's not able to absorb any nutrients. So canola, it's got all three against it, unfortunately. But again, tomorrow we're going to talk about the different things we do to make sure we have canola and these things don't take over. But yep, canola, fungi, insects, and weeds. And then finally, we're going to talk about introduced species. You guys have really, really good background. I'm really impressed you remember this from Unit 1. Introduced species, they can be great. We'll talk tomorrow about how that is a way to, or how it's a form of pest control, but we need to make sure they don't get invasive. So an introduced species are a plant, an animal, or any organism that is not native to the area. When an introduced species does not have a natural predator, it may become an invasive species. So again, you guys had some really good examples. I know Wes talked about, we read an article about toads in Australia. The toads were brought in to take care of some of the insects, and the toads were not native there. They were brought in to take care of the insects. That was great. But then there was nothing to kill the toads. So then they overpopulated. Well, what do you do about it? Pythons in Florida, we talked about. People get pythons as pets. They don't want them anymore. They just put them out into the wild. They're not supposed to be in the wild in Florida. They're non-native there. And remember, they completely took over. We talked about how there are some pythons that could eat whole deer. And then zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are found in the Great Lakes and in some other areas of water. They filter through the water, but there's certain types of mussels that overpopulate really, really fast, and they were taking away a lot of the filtration ability and all of the things in the water from the other types of mussels in that body of water. We talked about a ton of these. If you want, you can go back to Unit 1 and read about them even more. But an introduced species can become a form of a pest when it becomes invasive. Takes over habitats, takes over the food, eats the crops, eats the flowers, eats the plants, etc. So real quick, we're just going to talk about a couple of things that were accidentally introduced and then things that were purposely introduced. So accidentally, whoops, most of the weeds that cause crop losses were accidentally introduced from Europe. So here's a picture of chickweed from your textbook. It's a common weed pest that was introduced to Canada from Europe. Quackgrass, thistle, and chickweed are all examples. Oops, it came from Europe and now it's taking over. Accidentally introduced. Another one, we got a bark boring beetle. A non-native insect also causes problems in fields and forests. The tiny European bark boring beetle arrived in North America in 1940 with a shipment of elm logs from the Netherlands. So they were shipping over some wood from the Netherlands, and these bark boring beetles came with it by accident. The beetle's damage to elm trees was relatively light, so it didn't really do much to the elm or the logs, but it brought a fungus with it called Dutch elm disease and has since wiped out nearly all the native elm trees in North America. So this little bug, it was okay, but it brought fungus with it. And again, almost all the native elm trees in North America have been completely wiped out. And then purposely introduced, I thought this was super interesting. So some of the foreign weed species came by accident, but others came on purpose. The dandelion. The dandelion was brought from Europe to be used as a salad vegetable. I am not telling you to go eat dandelions. Make it clear, this is recorded. Do not go eat dandelions. But previously, people from Europe had them on salads. And so they brought them over to Canada. And then unfortunately, the insects and diseases that naturally control dandelion plants didn't come with it. So now you have this plant that they're growing, the dandelion, and the normal things in Europe that used to keep it in check through the food chain weren't here. So that's why dandelions started to take over. And now here we are with dandelions as weeds and not just a salad garnish. I thought that was pretty crazy. Bosco wants to use it for cooking. All right. So again, real quick, we talked about insects, we talked about fungi, and we talked about introduced or invasive species as forms of pests. So I want you're going to take a 5-minute break. While you're on break, I want you to think about how this relates to Unit 1, or be ready to just share something that you learned today that was really interesting. The dandelion on salads, I thought that was really crazy. I just can't imagine picking a dandelion and throwing it in a nice salad. But when we come back, you're all going to share before we start working on our assignment. All right, it is 12:26. I would like to see everyone back at 12:31 with your cameras on. Great job being engaged in that chat today, you guys. I'm so proud. All right, I'll see you in 5.